It's terrific today to introduce David Meldrum. Would you please welcome David to the stage?
It's great not to be the oldest person in the room for once, Andrew. When I see people like Andrew, I get a heavy sense of the years rolling by and all the reform processes that both he and I have been involved in, and what it all adds up to, or doesn't add up to. I've just stepped up here, so, yep. I'm going to run through a bit of an analysis of Partners in Recovery and the NDIS today, but I first of all want to just summarise what I want to say. The first is that the NDIS will be doing a lot less than you think it will for people dealing with mental illness, particularly serious mental illness. And I'll explain that a bit. So anybody who thinks that it's either going to take over your whole world or relieve you of all of your responsibilities is completely wrong. The second is that finding the target population that the NDIS, what used to be called Tier 3, is now called individually funded packages, is not easy. Engaging with that population is not easy. Helping that population define their needs is not easy. And helping those people get the other services they need outside of a disability service is not easy. And that's where Partners in Recovery could be playing a major role. That's the main stuff I'll be talking about. I can feel a couple of digressions coming on, but I'll try to limit them because we've only got half an hour. That's where I come from, by the way, the Mental Illness Fellowship of Australia. Our member organisations all around the country, including Mental Health Carers Tasmania, hi Wendy, we're back there somewhere, really have as their main focus people dealing with serious mental illness and their families. We branch a bit wider than that, we branch a lot wider than that, but that's our core strength around the country. So we're intensely interested, therefore, in both Partners in Recovery and the NDIS. Speaking for myself, Partners in Recovery, I've been all over it since it was a twinkle in Mark Butler's eye, the previous mental health minister in the... Was he in the Rudd government? I can't remember, but he was certainly in the Gillard. He was in both, wasn't he, Frank? Since he first thought of the idea that the key issue was coordination per se being required, not just new services. And I was on the expert working group that unusually, in the case of the Department of Health, was actually offered a real opportunity to help design the program. And I've been up with it ever since. So I'm now on the expert working group of the capacity building project and going to lots of events like these and visiting lots of Partners in Recovery programs. The NDIS have a slightly later relationship with. Frank Quinlan from Mental Health Australia described his and my engagement in the working parties for the NDIS as being asked to be the dressing on a salad that had already been fully designed. And that's, I'm afraid, that's the way it's felt ever since, trying to play catch up with a train that had already left the station. But I digress. Partners in Recovery and the NDIS share a number of goals. Now, about 2 years and 3 months ago, a few key bureaucrats who won't reveal themselves decided that Partners in Recovery and the NDIS were the same thing, and that all the money would go into the NDIS. That's a fairly silly assumption that doesn't understand either program very well. But nonetheless, they do have a lot of overlaps. People over here, can you see? Right. Very closely aligned target populations, not exactly aligned target populations. About 6 or 7 years ago, a guy called Harvey Whiteford from Queensland, allegedly in a restaurant after a couple of glasses of red on the back of a table napkin, when asked, worked out that there were about 57,000 people with severe and persistent mental illness and complex interagency problems in Australia. That's the absolute true origins of that figure, and it's never been demonstrated to have any greater provenance than that. But it's become holy writ. It's as if he didn't put it on the back of a table napkin, he wrote it in stone with a chisel. And then following that, about 3 years later, some people advising the fledgling NDIS said that's the number of people with severe and persistent mental illness and complex interagency problems and profound and long-lasting disability needs. It's the same population. So they came out with a figure that varied from 56 to 57,000. I don't know why. I'm probably not going to worry about it today, but that's a very flaky assumption to assume that there's an equivalence between the level of your illness and the level of your disability. To assume that, if you like, the most challenging two-hard basket is the same for both groups. It's a wild assumption, and there's been no grassroots attempt to identify how many people there are in the target population for the NDIS that fit that description. Nevertheless, it's what we've got to go with. I'll dwell on that a few seconds longer. There are many people with profoundly severe mental illness who do not have a lot of disability in their life. There are a lot of people with moderate mental illnesses who have profound disabilities in their life. So it's not the same thing. That's all I wanted to say. So closely aligned populations, although let's keep bearing in mind constantly, not the same population necessarily. To meet individual needs and aspirations, well, has anybody ever set up a program in the last 30 years that didn't say that? Well, they both say that. It's evolved from patient-centred to person-centred, but they both have that aspiration. I feel a digression. When I hear people in the NDIA, and they're only the latest crop, talking about choice and control as if it's just been thought of, I get really cross about it. I feel patronised. I feel deeply irritated that the suggestion that the programs that I've been involved in operating in the last couple of decades were not centred on that idea of trying, however imperfectly, to work out a way to get alongside a person and work out what it was they were trying to achieve and then help them get it. If that's not what it was all about, then I've been wasting my time. But choice and control is the objective. To find sustainable supports for as long as they're needed. You recognise that language if you're involved in PIR immediately. I don't think it's as well understood in the disability model because it's so tightly connected with notions of recovery and self-management, but it's roughly the same idea. You're not just looking for something that will be a patch-up job for the next 12 months, you're trying to build a sustainable pathway to a decent quality of life. And to modify the service system. Partners in Recovery from the start has been a very unusual model in that you've been given a lot of money to try to change the way things work. I put the word system up there even though I don't actually believe in it. I think a mental health system doesn't exist and almost can't exist because people's needs are too complex. It's like saying there's a life system out there. There are so many elements of government and non-government that you need around you to have a decent quality of life when you've got a severe mental illness and a lot of disabilities that it's never going to be a system. However, there are some gaps that need bridges built over them specifically for some individuals, even when you get lucky for some quite large groups, that will make a difference. It won't end up being a system, but it will join up a couple of the dots here and there that really matter, the gaps that matter. So there are shared goals. The other thing that Partners in Recovery and the NDIS have going for them is that they've got the idea that if you centre things around a region, that you can get to the stage where a bunch of people around a table about as big as this can actually sort things out. Sorting things out for the whole of Tasmania, let alone the whole of New South Wales, is a really, really big undertaking. Break it down to a region, you can start to get somewhere. So, of course, the problem in Tasmania is that you've only got one region for these things, so you have to deal with the whole state. But at least you've got this concept of we've got the same patch. You are, in fact, the only place in Australia that's got exactly the same patch between the two programs, funnily enough. certainly in places like the Hunter and in Barwon, this has proved absolutely invaluable in being able to get the same child protection, justice, mental health, GP organisations, and the mental. I did say mental health, to get the key systems around the table to talk about building some of those bridges. So that's critical. You've got this notion of partnership being possible in a given region. I don't know how you're going to do it in Tasmania. Every time I talk to Wendy, I think, here's a place that's intensely regionalised in the minds of its inhabitants, and yet from Canberra it was always described as one region. I don't know how you do it. The obvious thing to me, most obvious thing to me about Partners in Recovery is that it can find and engage people who more often than not will be eligible for an individually funded package. The thing that's not built into the disability model is finding the people and engaging the people. Because in general, in most of the areas of disability that were front of mind when the NDIS was being developed, were people whose numbers were almost exactly known. We know how many people there are in wheelchairs. We know before birth how many people there will be with a number of disabilities. When you come to the area of mental health, it's incredibly difficult to work out how many people there might be out there that fit your target population, whatever it is. I'll just run through a few figures there. Variously in Australia, between 1.9 and 4.3 million people are described as having a mental health problem or a mental health condition. Variously between 1.9 million and 2.6 million are described as seeking professional help each year. How are you going to find 56,000 out of all of that? Who are they? I'll come back to that a bit later. But the NDIA needs your help. Well, they need the help of somebody like the sort of skill set that a lot of you are in this room have got, finding these people. Secondly, engaging. I'm not going to preach to the converted. You know that a process that says, come to the office, have a conversation with us, look at a few forms and start ticking the boxes of where you think you need help, is not going to work for very many of the people that fit your population. It's just not going to happen. More typically will be months of meeting and engaging. More typically, you will arrive at something in a relationship with a person. You will arrive at something in which, in fact, the process of, if you like, assessment, sounds a bit third party, but I'll use it for the moment, the process of assessment and the process of reform and recovery and change, they're all happening at once. The engagement process with somebody who's got a long-standing severe mental illness and a lot of disabilities in their life and a very poor quality of life is a slow process and a complicated multidimensional process. At this point, I had to be really careful in not sounding like a precious mental health person who says only we know how to do this. I talk with a number of NDIA people who say every group thinks they're special. Every group thinks none of our people know how to deal with vision impairment, deafness, MS, etc., etc. And that, you know, the NDIA generalists will be hopeless at it and make a mess of it. So I have to stop and think each time, am I sure I know what I'm talking about here? Is the process of engagement with people with a long-standing severe mental illness something that's best done by people who know that territory? I do think unapologetically, yes, it is. But I'm aware that if there was an NDIA audience here, they'd be at me in a flash, saying, everybody says that. Identifying needs, obviously, that's what you guys do. I heard a bloke from Horsham the other day, a PIR worker who was trying to describe to a rather hostile audience of clinicians what it is he does. And he said, I'm just trying to get alongside people and get to know them to try and work out it is what they want and then see if I can help them get it. And you could see the audience sort of trying to unpick and fault that sentence, but it's impossible to fault. That's what the methodology is about, getting alongside people and finding out what they want. I've just finished reading a book, here's a digression, called The Second Son. I can't remember the author, I think it's going to be a bestseller, where this old lady eyeballs the central character in the book and says, first thing she says to him when she first meets him, have you got the life you want? Which is a terrifying question to be asked, if you think about it. But in a way, that's what you do in PIR. You get alongside people and you're asking the question, have you got the life you want? And if not, what might it look like and how can we work together to get it? And this last bit, maximising supports, the key thing to remember about, one of the key things to remember about the NDIS is it will never be more than a disability support system. It will not do anything like as much as it should be doing about accommodation. It will not be doing much about the Centrelink payment that keeps stopping. It will not be sorting out your problems with corrections. It will not be stepping in with child protection who are agreeing that you shouldn't have access to your children. And in particular, it will not help you access clinical services in an ongoing way. It may for some temporary assessment stuff, but it will not help you access the range of things that you need, if I can use a well-worn word, to get the holistic response that you need. The NDIS will never be that. It needs a partner who's working with the common client who can help make sure people can get those things. That's what you guys do, and could do with the NDIS. I'm not going to be one of those people who reads everything out. I think these are repeating points I've made. Oh. Okay, so I'll try not to talk over you when you're reading it. So I've made most of those points, I think. There's bound to be a duplication of effort between the NDIA planners, assessors, support, local area coordinators. You'll be doing a lot of the same work. In the Hunter, there's a Partners in Recovery program. The manager there is Sally Regan. And it's got to the stage in the Hunter now where the relationship is so close that the PIR team saying, this person is one for you, and here's the process we've got to so far in helping identify their needs, they're almost in. The relationship has now got to the stage where they're almost in. The NDIS people are saying, thank you for that. You've found them, you've engaged with them, you've started the process of identifying what the needs might be. We'll work alongside you from now on. We don't even need to take over completely. We'll work alongside you until the process is complete. That's the way it should be. There are several other places in trial sites where that's not happening, where you hear lots of stories that concern you about those processes not being handled well. Look at these most commonly identified goals: increasing social engagement and community engagement, assistance with accommodation, mental health issues with a health professional, support to improve daily living skills. There's a mixture of PIR and NDIS all over that. I want to come to the issue now of numbers, of who these people are. The key advisor to the NDIS when it was being set up, when it came up with its magic number of, what was it, 482,000 people, of whom 56 or 57,000 were, 56,000 there, fitted this description: severe and persistent mental illness, complex needs requiring coordinated services from multiple agencies. You'll see down at the bottom here, 3 included. Clinical services are not included. The main thing on that diagram to look at, and this is the official advice that helped set up the NDIS and made the decisions about who was going to get services for psychiatric disability, as they were calling it then. The main thing about this is look at all the not included. That is not a description of the worried well or the occasionally mildly distressed. These are people with severe mental illnesses, with a variety of needs, who are likely to be disabled in many domains of life, and needing help, but they're not in the last 56,000. Again, rather similar to the way the thinking went around who was the PIR population, but not quite the same population. Remember that list up there. They said in fact there's 424,000 people outside who range from episodic mental illness needing occasional disability support services through to quite much more severe. So look at those figures, and what you can see up there is that 80% aren't covered by the NDIS. This is out of a whole variety of exercises that have been done in the last few years, including a ginormous one that Frank and I were both involved in called the National Mental Health Services Planning Framework. Been a variety of attempts made to describe the populations that exist who are affected by mental illness and disability in Australia. This is the most recent, if you like, bare metal respray of the whole topic. It was done by the National Mental Health Commission, and surprisingly, starting from absolute scratch with a completely new set of assumptions and new sets of data, they came up with a figure that was fairly close, 65,000 people. Very high level of need, severe and persistent illness with complex multi-agency needs, required significant clinical care and day-to-day support. Fairly close. So we're sort of all agreeing that we know there's roughly 50 or 60 or a bit more thousand people out there who need this service. But again, look who's just outside there with a high level need of support. Another 210,000 people. Look who's out there with a moderate level support. Another 415,000 people. So I just want to make the point right now that the people who in March 2013 said, there's a whole variety of programs here that appear to be serving the 56,000 people, were ignoramuses. The people who said that FAMS fits that exactly, that carer, respite and education fits that exactly, that PIR fits that exactly, were completely off the page. They made a category error. So much of those services are outside of that tiny little bit of the triangle at the top. So we've had a policy travesty happen there, which still threatens to rob a whole bunch of people in those larger numbers of access to services that were hard won only 9 or 10 years ago. So, no, I didn't want that. I did some numbers myself last night, looking at the NDIS in Tasmania. I reckon you're going to get 1,254 packages from the entire NDIS by the time it's fully rolled out in 2019-20. When I went looking at the data sets for your mental health services, I found curiously that the whole of Victoria refused to provide stats on who's in their mental health services. I thought that was curious that aligned in the same year when cutbacks were being made. But no figures were provided about who was getting services. But in Tasmania, some industrial action, must have been about 18 months or so ago, actually messed up the stats for this state, and so there's an imperfect record. So I made some extrapolations from those other states that did faithfully provide their mental health services stats. And I think your mental health services have got somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 people who have regular contact with them. If that's right, that would mean you've got roughly the same picture here as you have in other states. If you just look at, say, the people who make it to the long-term caseload of the mental health services, only about 15% of them will be covered by the NDIS. And remember, those 15% will still need all of the same clinical services. So around Australia, the other policy travesty that keeps threatening us right at the moment is that health ministers representing the mental health system through their mental health directors are negotiating with the Commonwealth Government in bilateral agreements about how much more money to roll into the NDIS. The health system cannot afford to give away $1 because no clients are going away. The majority will get nothing from the NDIS, and those that do will still not get clinical services from the NDIS. So health systems should not give away another single dollar to the NDIS. It's no reflection on the beauty of what will be provided. It's just an honest appraisal of what won't be provided and what needs to continue to be provided. I had a look at the figures in Queensland just the other day, and there it was 12% of the people on the long-term caseload of the mental health services would get a package. I had a look at it in South Australia the other day, and it came to 14% of the people on the long-term caseloads of the mental health services would get an NDIS package. I put those figures to Eddie Bartnick, who's the key advisor to the NDIA on mental health issues. And his response was, I'm hearing that figure in every state. I think it's right. I think that's what it is. So those people who say to you, the whole world is about to change, the NDIS is coming to town, everything's going to be different, are completely wrong. We should all agree, I think, particularly those who've been around for a long time, that we did a lousy job of the last part of deinstitutionalisation. We did a lousy job for whoever these 50 or 60,000 people are around Australia in making sure they had comprehensive, reliable support. We didn't give them a DVA gold card that said, when you need help, it'll be there. We continue to not be able to rise to the occasion with the people whose needs were intense and long-term ongoing. So that's great. But the NDIS only promises to get to that really challenging small group, no others. One of the key things that the disability support model as developed by the NDIA or the NDIS board, or I'm never quite sure how the governance structures work. It claims to be a non-government agency when it suits it and a government agency when it does. But it appears to have a board, and it regularly talks about what's in a package. And what's only started recently to emerge is the concept that there may be a need for coordination as an ongoing aspect of the package. Well, duh, of course there will be. But the even more recent realisation that's starting to be talked about is that there may be a need for intensive personal support as an ongoing part of the package. Not the sort that you get from a personal attendant or a companion, but the sort you get from a FAMS worker or a PIR worker or a HASI worker or a HASP worker. The sort of intensive personal support from an experienced mental health worker, possibly a P worker, that does not come at $20 an hour. It's not well paid, it's generally about $28 an hour, but it doesn't come at $20 an hour. The whole concept of who might be needed to make the package work is starting to include the notion that ongoing coordination and ongoing intensive personal support have to be part of the package. That conversation has only just started in the last couple of months. You would be completely unsurprised that that would be the way that you have to think about working with people with this level of disability. It comes as a real surprise to the model that the NDIA has had until very recently. The ILC framework, Information Linkages and Capacity Building, which emerged out of some COAG processes just before Christmas, is about how there'll be a lot of money around for helping people find out what their opportunities are, link them up to the mainstream options that are there, and capacity build in the mainstream. By the mainstream, we mean everything else apart from the NDIS. That's what everybody means in wherever they come from when they say mainstream. They mean the other people who are not pulling their, not pulling their weight. So the emergency departments that are not doing what they should be, the GPs that are not doing what they should be, the child protection services, the correctional services, the education services, etc., employment services not doing what they should be, will all be helped by the ILC framework over the next 3 or 4 years to lower the barriers of discrimination so that in fact loads of people will get what they need and won't need the NDIS. I shouldn't let a note of mockery enter into that because I don't mean to. That's all really important work. It sort of describes what most of us have been doing, in my case, for nearly 40 years. But the notion that that will all go away in a very short time because of brilliant new projects that no one's ever thought of before is magical thinking. The other thing to remember, though, about that funding for the ILC is, if I could just use my arms as an example, this is where we are now, a few packages about 1,000 people have got a package because of mental health needs in the NDIS. This is 2019 when there's 57,000 people. Well, here's the ILC funding. Starting in July, there'll be lots of rounds of offers for projects under ILC funding. And that's great. And a lot of service providers, including your own agencies, will probably jump on board and should, because there'll be heaps of good opportunities to capacity build, to lower those barriers to discrimination, to build new understandings, etc. But in 2019, all the money will be needed. For Tasmania, my guess would be there'll be about 500,000 a year on offer for all of those information linkages and capacity building projects for Tasmania. The rest will all be going to the 1,254 packages. So the good news is there's money coming. The bad news is that in 3 or 4 years' time, it all stops if you haven't got a package. When I asked key NDIA people 2 or 3 times over the past 3 months, but what will happen to all the other people? They said, well, the money will have to come from some other source. Not our problem. We've got the money for FAMS, we've got the money for respite, we've got the money for PIR, we've got various other bits of money, DCDL in our budget. That's a locked away deal. If gaps have opened up in 2019 that ILC hasn't solved, that money comes from somewhere else, it's not our problem. So there's a looming catastrophe there unless we work really well at 2 things. One is make the best of that ILC money while we can, but at the same time recognise that it's only going to last for a short time. System change, you know I said I don't believe in the system, but the best PIRs are doing some amazing things at building bridges for people that matter. So the NDIA needs you as a partner. To my amazement, over the past 3 or 4 weeks, I've heard 2 senior NDIA people say we might need PIR as a partner. There's a couple of immediate problems with that. First of which is about 20% of the Australian population doesn't have a PIR program. So what we're going to do there. But I think there is a growing recognition that in the mental health area, the NDIS cannot reach its potential without some sort of expert partner in the process. Since they've got the money for you coming to them on July the 1st, 2016, they're going to want to use it. I think our policy priority is to demonstrate over the next 12 months or so that the right use of that money is as the gateway to the NDIS and as a service provider to the NDIS for things like intensive personal support ongoing. I think I can see an emerging model where, as the gateway, you would be block funded, because it's the only way to do it. And for intensive personal supervision and ongoing coordination, it could be a contractor paid in arrears in the NDIS model. I can see this scenario starting to flitter around in the minds of NDIA people and not be rejected out of hand. They're starting to realise this mental health thing is quite complicated. They still think we're very precious and that there are lots of things that they can do that will bring a refreshing new perspective to the way we think about the needs of people with mental illness, and they're probably right. But they're starting to recognise that the process of finding these people, engaging with them and helping work through how you identify the life that they want and what it might look like in the way of disability support, they need partners who know this territory. I heard the, am I close to time? Where am I? Who's timing me? Am I close? Right. I heard the Minister responsible, Mitch Fifield, talking a couple of months ago. And he said several things about the NDIS. He said it's the biggest policy change since Medicare, which I thought was a pretty big call because Medicare covers all of Australia. And this covers 15% of people with mental illness. So that was a big call. And he said, get ready for everything to change because the NDIS world is coming. Well, you know, if the NDIS is the world, at the moment it's about the size of Tuvalu, possibly Estonia. You know, by the time we get to 2019-20, it might claim to be as big as Germany, but it ain't going to be the whole world. I don't know about many of the other people in this room, but what I signed for in the area of mental health was the project of trying to help reach a better quality of life for people and their families who are affected by serious mental illness. At least 80, probably 90% of that project will not be covered by the NDIS. What's more important in this immediate context is that we don't want to see the good things that are happening blown away in the process. We've already seen services called FAMS and others rolled into this, and we're trying to work out ways to undo that damage, that category error. Let's stop thinking now that the NDIS is a brand new world where everything will be different. The majority of mental health services, if you want to call them that, the majority of ways of getting help, the majority of ways of getting an appropriate response when you're trying to deal with the issues that flow from mental illness will not come from the NDIS, even in 2020 when the full scheme is fully rolled out. However, it will be a very important bit of the jigsaw puzzle for those people absolutely most in need. And Partners in Recovery can be a really vital partner in that process. I think you should all be thinking that way. Is there anything you can do in the meantime to try and make sure something like that happens? Keep on demonstrating that you're good at what you do. I mean, I know it's a trite thing to say. Keep on demonstrating that you're good at what you do. This government in Canberra at the moment has never said one kind word about Partners in Recovery in public. It was a fanciful dream thought up by that other mob. And it was, you know, to be fair, when Mark Butler brought this to Cabinet, many of his own ministers at the time said, we don't need coordinators, we need more we need more services. All I hear all day is the gaps in mental health services. He had a job getting it through the Labor Party Cabinet, but it became Labor Party policy. It's widely misunderstood. I mean, I spoke last year to a group of about 100 psychiatrists at one of their conferences, and it's the most hostile audience I've ever spoken to. One of them eventually said it. That money was stolen from evidence-based clinical services for an idea that's got no evidence base. So there's a lot of hostility and misunderstanding out there about Partners in Recovery. The only thing that's going to counteract that is you paying close attention to doing good work and getting the story out about the good work you're doing. And making sure that the people who matter hear it. And I'll just finish by saying there's 2 or 3 parties who are those people who matter. Policy changes, like for example the current bilateral discussions between the NDIA and Partners in Recovery, really the big high-level ones happen in the advisory processes to COAG. The advisors to COAG are the directors of mental health. The Director of Mental Health for Tasmania, by whatever name he or she goes by, is the person who says what should happen next. Who's advising them? You know Tasmania better than I do. Who's advising them and what would they be saying about Partners in Recovery? I must say I've been to a lot of places in Australia where the public mental health services and Partners in Recovery are not good friends. You need to be really good friends because the key policy advice about your future will come from the people who are advising the Director of Mental Health in Tasmania. The second group are politicians. And who influences politicians? Sad to say it's not consumers. It's not people with mental illness. We all should be trying in our own little ways, and certainly my organisation, MIFA, is to change that. The people who influence politicians to do with mental illness are carers, middle-class carers, middle-class, middle-aged carers. What would they be saying about Partners in Recovery in Tasmania? What are you doing about making sure they know about the good things you're doing? That's the second key group. The third key group is organised medicine. In this case, I think that organised psychiatry in Australia is, in general, at the top levels, very sympathetic to the holistic approaches and the system-changing approaches that Partners in Recovery represents. That's what I tend to hear from them. But GP land isn't. What would GP land be saying about Partners in Recovery in Tasmania, particularly? So if you're thinking about how to help make sure that Partners in Recovery does become a highly valuable part of the NDIA, of the NDIS, keep on doing really good work, keep on telling everybody about it, but particularly make sure the public mental health services, the carers, and organised GP land gets to hear about it, because that way you'll secure your future. Thank you.
Any questions for David, please? Thank you. Thanks, Julie. If you just wait for the microphones, they will come. Sorry once again for the clanking air conditioning. We're all starting to get used to it, I hope.
Bit of a sort of a question or assumption. If we lose those 85 to 90% of participants that won't be encapsulated by the NDIS, wouldn't they potentially fall into the NDIS not getting that upstream support and sort of moving into the chaos? Would it sort of be a sort of paradoxical process from a funding perspective?
Look, I think that's always the theory we should present as forcefully as we can. It's sometimes rather difficult to prove. In the bar one, I was talking to someone the other day who had a whole range of programs like FAMS and a number of others, what they call PIR2015 services in Victoria. And now they're providing services in the NDIS, they're providing package services. And this was Liz Crowther, she was saying about at least half of the people that we used to service have disappeared. We don't know where they are. It's difficult to make the case that they've started crowding up emergency departments and are going back to relying more on GPs, and that the Salvation Army have got more people queuing up at the door. But it is a highly plausible common sense thing to be saying. It's just really always the problem of community health and community support initiatives. We really do find it very difficult. I could, from this room, I could gather dozens of anecdotes about reduced hospitalisation because of good intervention through programs like FAMS and PIR and so on. No one's proved it. And so what you get from a Treasury or a Department of Finance official, and they're the final people who make policy, is all I can see is an extra program. No one's proved to me there's any less pressure on the emergency department. No one's shown to me that the number of consults about mental health with GPs have gone down. So it's very difficult to demonstrate the case. I just say that so that you don't find yourself saying things that get shot down in flames. At the level of saying it is clearly plausible that if you do not do that sort of preventative work, you're going to see more pressure downstream. I hate those phrases. It's people we're talking about here. You're going to see more people in unnecessary distress, they and their families being torn apart by things that didn't need to happen. You're going to see more of that. It's entirely plausible. We all know from our own anecdotal experience that it's right. I just hope for the day when we get to the point where we can say this study and this study and this study proved it in Australia.
Another question.
I've got another question.
Rebecca. Oh, Alida, sorry.
Sorry. Hi, David. I'm wondering how likely it is that we can actually reverse those decisions on FAMS and respite and PIR. I mean, we all are trying to advocate for that, but do you think that we will get there?
Anything's possible, but I think that the horse is bolted with those names on it at least. Whether we can continue funding essentially the same programs at essentially the same level with monies yet to be identified, I'm not sure. You won't find anybody in the NDIA who wants to give away $1 of it. They've got their forward estimates. They know what they're going to spend. So if you ask any of them, they'll say that's done. There's no point in talking about that. You're talking about a past era. As far as they're concerned, July 2016 has already arrived. You know, it's done. What we've got to do is keep on advocating about the needs of the people who are likely to miss out. They now know that that's right. I think the most interesting thing that I've heard in recent times has been people like Eddie Barnick and even Nick Hartland and people in DSS saying, yes, you're roughly right, there's a couple of 100,000 people who are going to miss out here around Australia. No one's going to put their hand up to be the first one to try and unscramble the egg, which doesn't consist of one simple agreement around Australia. Every bilateral is completely different. You'll find one state that's thrown in all of its community support services for people with mental illness and another state that's thrown in none. There's no agreement with Queensland yet, for example. That's 4.5 million people. So it's really hard to unscramble all the different arrangements. When the Commonwealth thought they'd lead the charge in the time when they were trying to persuade everybody to sign on for the NDIS by saying, you can have all of this. And I don't think I found anybody who wants to revisit that. The ILC appears to offer some comfort, and I think it does actually. I think that you'll find a number of arrangements which might be FAMs continued under another name and other programs continued under another name for the next 2 or 3 years. But remember that funding thing. Where's the money going to come from when you get down to here? We've got an intense amount of lobbying to do to protect the services for people who are not going to be covered by the NDIS. We're not there yet. Thanks, Alita.
Would you join me in thanking David? It's just been terrific insight, and I do appreciate the fact that he's come down here to speak to us and join with us. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Good to see you.